Welcome to Joffier Whispers. My name is Nairi. This podcast was first recorded in February this year, but I feel it's worth revisiting. In my very first video, I mentioned Alvin Toffler, who wrote the book Future Shock in 1970. Future shock was described as an illness that came out of too much change in too short a period of time. We need consistency in our lives. We need to feel safe. We need to know that we can rely on, we need to know what we can rely on to feel mentally and emotionally stable. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to find that stability, not just in our physical environment, but in the public realm and our collective belief systems. I hear so many people say they just don't know what to believe anymore because there's such an overload of conflicting information and opinions. How do we really know what is in fact just opinion? And how are we to negotiate this present world of future shock, because it's no longer in the future? It's not going to subside at any time soon. The rate of change continues exponentially at this very moment in time. And how are we going to survive it as a species? Because with the development rate of artificial intelligence, with all the current social issues, with the wars unfolding, well, one war, and a second one that's really a genocide of hundreds of thousands of innocent people, and the partisan beliefs of so many people politically, we really are moving into dangerous waters. How do we negotiate that? Do we stand by helplessly? Do we remain indifferent? Or do we make sure we educate ourselves as to what is really behind all this and do what we can within our own sphere to ensure we proceed forward safely? There's a reason these Joffier Whispers podcasts are subtitled Knowledge, Wisdom, Spirituality and Empowerment. They're all tied together somehow. Without knowledge, there can be no wisdom. Without wisdom, there's little sense of the spiritual nature of the universe. And without all three, there's no empowerment. Knowledge, or rather the application of knowledge, is power. The problem is, however, how do we know what knowledge is? How do we know what we know? How do we understand that? When I was a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, I'd sometimes lie in bed at night listening to twinkling noises outside the window, and with my limited knowledge, genuinely thinking it was the sound of the stars twinkling. My child's mind had no conception of the idea that the stars were physical bodies so far out in space that it was impossible to reach them from the Earth. They were just twinkling lights in a dark blanket overhead. I believed it for a long time until I realised sometime later that the source was possums on the roof. I'd never seen a possum and I had no idea what one might look like. But because as an adult I believe I know something about astronomy and the universe, then if we suddenly discovered the universe isn't what we think it is, I think that would be quite distressing. I think that would be really difficult to accept, because what I know about the universe is what I've been taught. It's been what I observe with my own eyes, so it has some kind of veracity, but it still may not be true. We don't cope well psychologically when the reality on which we base our basic beliefs is challenged. I watched a video a few months ago of a street survey where a surprising number of people, mostly women, said men could have babies. Where does a belief like that come from? They seemed absolutely convinced it was true. But it's not knowledge, it's a myth, some kind of brainwashing, because logical thinking about the subject and one's personal experience would lead one naturally to conclude it's just not true. Men can't have babies, not naturally anyway. It just demonstrates how sowing the seed of doubt can lead to unrealistic conclusions for those who are not well grounded in their thinking. Even more disturbingly, I viewed a clip from a survey of children around maybe 8 years old of mixed racial backgrounds, where they were shown 5 identical avatars, identical except for skin and eye colour, ranging from deep brown to fair. Each child surveyed was asked questions such as, who is the good person, who's the clever person, who's the beautiful person, who's the intelligent person? And the results were actually quite shocking, because it was clear by the responses that they all had stereotyped images of the value of people based on skin colour. All the children, regardless of race or genetic background, chose the fairer side of the spectrum as inherently good, intelligent, beautiful, and so on, while the negative traits were attached to the dark-skinned avatars. I don't know which demographic these young people came from, but that shouldn't be relevant. Their responses were not based on knowledge, because it's very clear, both historically and in our personal experiences, that all those traits cover the full spectrum of genetic heritage, regardless of race or culture. Their responses were based on the collective myths of their socio-economic group or their cultural group, and not based on knowledge. So how do we know what we know? That might seem like a spurious question, but it amazes me how many really smart people I come across and see online subscribe to common myths or public opinion, as Walter Lippmann called it. So how do we decide that? In the final analysis, it comes down to the issue of brainwashing, as anyone who's watched the television show by Derren Brown will understand. And I've put a link below. You can see a very interesting episode where he persuaded an audience to participate in the apparent destruction of an innocent man's life by tapping into the collective mindset. The man was, as the audience found out at the end, actually an actor. But the results were really shocking, and more interestingly is that only a few audience members walked out during the process because they could see what was happening and they found it shocking. Most stayed and actively participated. Very troubling, worth watching. So how can we identify that issue of brainwashing in our own thinking? How do we know when we've been brainwashed? It's actually very difficult, because we're all susceptible to persuasion and mass hypnosis, especially through television and through childhood conditioning. But it does come down to critical thinking. The word critical doesn't mean to destroy something, but to critique it, to analyse, to reflect, to look for faults in a belief or a way of thinking. To do that requires logic, and the problem with brainwashing is that it bypasses logic. And the main source of brainwashing in the modern world, apart from television, is our mobile phones. Repeated ideas become imprinted in our brains, which is obviously why television advertising is so successful, especially when products appeal to the flaws in our self-worth or our self-identity, and when it taps into issues of gender and social status. I mean, there are many men out there who really believe that the power of attraction is measured by their wealth, or owning the right car, or how big their muscles are, while there are many women who are persuaded that the clothes they wear, or the right makeup, or having large breasts is a ticket to success in finding a partner. Is that real? Is that how most of us perceive the world? Perhaps it is. But it bypasses other more important aspects of our lives, including issues of morality and selfless behaviour. And perhaps valuing those things has, again, something to do with propaganda, with brainwashing, the natural inclination. I don't know the answer to that, but it's just a question. As a high school student studying biology, I was taught, along with my peers, that Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was a proven scientific fact. It was never taught as a theory, which is all it actually was. Even Darwin himself, in a preamble to the book, wrote that if it were ever proved that the cells in the body are of irreducible complexity, then his theory would break down. Irreducible complexity means that if any one component is altered or removed, the cell is no longer functional. In other words, it's a mechanical system with all parts intricately connected and essential to the functioning of the system. We're not talking about genetic manipulation, which has been carried out for decades. We're talking about natural processes. But it's more fundamental than that. There's an evolutionary biologist named Michael J. Beer who believes he has proved that the cells are indeed of irreducible complexity. And I watched a conversation a few years ago amongst some top American mathematicians who claimed that even if the phenomenon of evolution does exist, it would be statistically impossible for human beings to have evolved out of early hominids in such a short period of time, if at all. So why is that important? Well, it has everything to do with where do we really come from. I think most of us have always believed we were descended from ancestors of the apes. Is that true? It may be, but it's not provable at this point in time. And yet all those years later, that subject of evolution was still being taught in schools as scientific fact. We were taught to trust the science. So the question then is, which science? All science is theory. No self-respecting scientist will claim that the results of their research are definitive unless the results are 100% consistent over large numbers of samples. And even then there's room for doubt, because while the outcomes might be consistent, the actual cause might be quite unrelated to the initial postulates, or even postulates that hadn't even been considered prior to doing the research. Scientific research is complicated in its implications. The other myth is that Charles Darwin was the first to talk about the origin of species, by the way, but the work of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck predates Darwin. It was Lamarck who came up with the idea of evolutionary theory. Darwin simply set out to try and prove that theory. Just thought I'd throw that in. I come back to Walter Lippmann and his ideas around public opinion, which I spoke about in my last video and won't go into again now. But he claimed that none of us can know all the facts related to any issue, which is why we tend to rely on other people's input. In small communities, that works fine, where people have constant contact with one another. But when the demographic is hundreds of thousands, if not millions, the room for error is huge. Chinese whispers. But we live in a collective world, and each of us takes in information based on our own personal biases, our culture, our family dynamics, personal experience, and no two people hear a message in the same way, so our belief systems are archetypal, as we saw with the children I mentioned before making value judgments based on skin colour. Lippmann said, and I quote, "At the core of every moral code there is a picture of human nature, a map of the universe, a version of history. To human nature of the sort conceived in a universe of the kind imagined after a history so understood, the rules of the code apply." In other words, whether they're factual or fiction, our codes of conduct are based on common beliefs, whether true or untrue, but they're accepted as common knowledge, even if they're not. Lippmann goes on later to say, "But in the codes that are under the influence of science, the conception is known to be an hypothesis, whereas in the codes that come unexamined from the past or bubble up from the caverns of the mind, the conception is not taken as an hypothesis demanding proof or contradiction, but as a fiction accepted without question." He goes on to say further, "In the one case, a man is humble about his beliefs because he knows they are tentative and incomplete. On the other, he is dogmatic because his belief is a completed myth." So what he's basically saying is that while our social and cultural beliefs are mythological, they do serve as a unifying factor, but in science, the true seeker after truth is humble in his beliefs, which are always tentative and incomplete, in other words, open to question, and that any conclusions based on imagination or unexamined past results are dogma, a fiction which is not open to question, a fiction that's believed. Albert Einstein apparently is accredited with having quoted, "No amount of experimentation can ever prove me right. A single experiment can prove me wrong." Perhaps that seeking for knowledge, for truth, requires that more and more of us make at least some attempt to have a scientific approach to what we do. Not as a knowledgeable scientist, but as in questioning everything, asking questions, coming up with theories, but asking questions, not just giving answers and accepting them blindly. I'm reminded of the words of a medical researcher and former advisor to the US government, trust the science. Which science? Which scientists? There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of scientists around the world who would differ in their opinions about the way the recent so-called pandemic was managed. The whole point about science is that you don't trust it. It's simply an indicator of trends or possibilities. And how many scientists agree with one another who work on the same areas of research? That's why they have conferences, because they want to compare notes and find out what works and what doesn't, where they agree and where they don't agree. They're always analysing and adjusting their beliefs. They're not set in their belief systems. Science is about questions, not answers. The phrase humble in his beliefs doesn't seem to be applicable in that recent instance. So many things we believed were true when I was young have proven to be fallacies over my long lifetime. Why are we now being asked to trust the science? I've learned over my lifetime you cannot trust the science. Some of it you can, but a lot of it you can't. So what are our collective myths in 2024 that are not cultural and specific, but general and worldwide? What's apparently important to us at the moment? Or what have we been persuaded to believe collectively are important? Climate change, gender issues, racial issues, who's on the right side with regard to the two current major conflicts, education, health, spiritual beliefs, partisan politics, aliens, historical truths, pollution, science. When I was young, about half those subjects weren't even on the table. So who decides which issues are relative to us collectively? Do you? Do I? No. Would you even think about them if they weren't sitting in front of you every night on the television? Would you even consider them? What's climate change? The climate has always been changing, so why is it an issue? If human consumption is the cause of current changes, then why are a select group of wealthy people flying to a certain place in private planes and living in huge mansions on large properties full of furniture and works of art? Is there really a problem? Why were a select group carrying on their lives as normal during the so-called pandemic, while the majority were in lockdown? If the disease was so dangerous that every human being in the world had to comply with restrictions, why were some exempt? They can't pass on the disease. They're not a problem. Should they have complied with the rest of the population? Or should the rest of the population have not had to comply? You can't have it both ways. What about education? What is the system we call an education system? It's a system. Educare means to bring out. What does a system have to do with bringing out anything? When I look at the comments on YouTube videos, I see very little evidence that most of those people can even write. I wonder what's happening with our so-called education system. I can't understand a lot of them because they make no sense. They can't write the Queen's English or anybody's English. They lack logic. They have a propensity to repeat slogans they've picked up from other sources, mythological stories. It's extremely common. But I think the question to ask is not whether current social and political morals could be improved, but what purpose they actually serve. Do you yourself know why schools were created in the first place at a time when intellectually gifted individuals had mentors? Why do we have a schooling system? Well, it wasn't the intelligent and the literate to whom the schools were targeted. That was the area of private schools. That was a whole new story. But in general, the schools were, the target was the uneducated in order to teach them enough skills to enter the workforce, the labouring workforce, to work in factories during the Industrial Revolution. Until the Industrial Revolution, most people worked on the land, but they were needed to man the new factories. An employee who doesn't have basic reading, writing and arithmetic skills, who can't read a clock face in order to get to work on time, isn't a good investment. They needed basic skills and they needed a sense of discipline. It wasn't about educating people for their own sakes. It was about supplying the industrial complex. When I was in school, we wore a school uniform that had specifications such as the length of the tunic from the ground or wearing a beret. We had marching squads. We had to line up into class. We were punished if we were late. We had to respond to the sound of the bell. Everything was highly structured. It was a very disciplined environment, and we learned our lessons really well. We were taught to have self-discipline, which is not a bad thing on a personal level, but there was a sense of homogeneity, of fitting into the lowest common denominator, or in my school's case, the highest common denominator. And the motto was strenue ac fideliter, with zeal and loyalty. That was our motto. Problems began to arise, however, in my country when it was decided that the overall structure was to be homogenised. There'd previously been two kinds of schools, one academic, the other technical, and those who wanted to do mechanical jobs. They were called technical schools, which has a different connotation to the technical schools in the US. So the students from technical schools were suddenly fed into the academic schools, and of course the standards of the high schools, as they were called, dropped as a consequence, while the students who would have benefited from a technical education floundered in an environment that was inappropriate to their needs. And the reasons for doing that, I think, are quite complex. I won't go into them, but what are the current discussions in education about? Are schools necessary in the current world? What industry are they feeding now? They don't need schools to feed industry anymore, or less and less so. Is there sufficient reason to have teenagers in institutions all day long for days every week when they could be learning on the job? They could be apprentices. What's wrong with that? Why are there no longer apprentices? I think the answer would probably be the anticipation of AI to take over those basic schools. So the question is, will that serve our best interests collectively? Another question to ask is, why do we have partisan politics? Why do we have two political parties in most countries? Why are governments reaching into our private lives? The role of government has traditionally been diplomatic negotiations with other countries, managing the economy, managing resources, not controlling our private lives. In the country I come from, Australia, the list of government departments is extremely long and has some very strange listings, but it does include a number of arts areas. Now, my question is not whether the arts are of value, but why is the government involved in the arts, funding the arts? Who decides the funding? What arts is the government supporting? The arts are not an industry, but they've been morphed into one. Art's about personal expression. Artistic expression comes from the individual, and we're all artists at a greater or lesser level. But government funding means government control over what is acceptable in creative endeavours. It's a political game aimed at giving the impression the government cares about personal expression and arts, but really who controls the money controls the outcome. Many so-called artists are more prepared to conform to an ideology when there's money involved, and that is anti-art really. A true artist is an observer, not a propagandist. And I know a lot of people will disagree with me. The arts are important. Yes, they are important. But once you start funding anything, then you have control over that entity. I'll give you money as long as you support my government's ideology. It's a self-destructive road to follow for a serious artist. It's a double-edged sword. If you're not already aware of the fact that most of the information you receive on social media or on all media is either not true or has only an element of truth, perhaps it's time to think about it now, because compliance with the messages currently being sent in the increasing government restrictions on our personal lives may well be humanity's downfall. It's time, if we're to maintain our power as a species, to be asking questions and expecting honest answers, not aspiring to the mindset of the collective. I'm not sure how many are prepared to even able to do that. But those of us conscious of the underlying psychological aspects of a society that seems to have lost its way, keep trying. I hope you keep trying. If you'd like to find out a little bit about me, you can go to my website, nairij.com. You can, there's a brief biography. You can look at some of my paintings and drawings. You can listen to some of my music. You can even read chapter 1 of my book, Joffiel Whispers. And I've put a few links below that relate to what I've been talking to you about today. I hope to see you next time. Until then, stay well, stay blessed.